So I'm here from the city of Bridgeport. Folks I'm sure are familiar with it. Most populous city in the state, on the coast. A lot of vulnerable infrastructure, a lot of vulnerable population. We'll talk a little bit about the impacts that we saw, but I'll talk a bit more about kind of what we learned from that, what our response has been over the last few months. We had significant impacts, not just in Sandy, but also in Irene. You can see, obviously, this is a picture during Irene on the left and a picture after Sandy on the right. Much of what we had repaired directly following Irene was broken and busted once again during Sandy. There is a one significant fundamental difference between Bridgeport and the surrounding communities. And it's probably not one that you might guess. When you drive along coastal Fairfield County, coastal New Haven County, I like to say that you typically come across one of three things: a fence, a wall, or a hedge. Right? It's mostly private property, it's mostly big estates, you're mostly walled off or protected from that amenity. Bridgeport is dramatically different than that. The bulk of our Long Island Sound frontage is publicly accessible. We have Seaside Park, Frederick Law Olmsted design. We have a lot of other smaller parks, St. Mary's by the Sea. And what that means is that those parks are able to act as a buffer. So the strategy that we tend to think about, retreat, natural solutions to buffer the population, actually already exists in large part throughout the city. So the majority of the damage that we see is concentrated within the public open space, which really puts us at an advantage compared to the surrounding communities. That being said, we obviously have a lot of significant regional infrastructure that is along the waterfront. We have three power plants, gas, coal, and waste to energy. We have two water pollution control treatment plants. We have a lot of electricity delivery infrastructure, and we, I think, are now very familiar with the vulnerabilities therein. I'll talk a little bit about the planning process that we went through, because we had a very robust plan that was done several years ago called Be Green. It's our sustainability plan. It really focused predominantly on mitigation, reducing emissions through transportation, building retrofits, etc. And really only recently has begun to focus more on adaptation. I think I'll skip that for now. Basically the biggest impacts that we saw were the necessary closure of the water pollution, the water treatment plants, which had impacts obviously on Long Island Sound, the loss of electricity for a significant amount of time, and that was predominantly due not to impacts to the generation plants, but to impacts to the distribution. Two of our largest substations, Congress Street and Ash Creek, are both within the 100-year floodplain, and frankly, it was very frustrating to see other utilities in the region, Con Ed, Connecticut Light and Power, implementing their adaptation strategy when the storm was coming, putting up the concrete barricades around substations, and to see our utility kind of scrambling, trying to figure out what to do, coming in at the last minute with sandbags, and really it ended up being the inundation of one substation directly adjacent to downtown that ended up shutting off power to about 60,000 people for a week. Had that single substation not flooded, the bulk of the city would have had electricity throughout the storm. So that's obviously particularly frustrating. Another source of frustration is our breakwaters. We have a deep water harbor, a deep water port, one of the three in Connecticut. We have breakwaters, obviously, marking the entrance to the port. As of about 3 or 4 years ago, at a full moon high tide, the breakwaters are completely underwater. And if you don't know the harbor, thankfully, I guess, a good impact of us not having a lot of harbor traffic is there's not a lot of boats that don't know the harbor and don't know where those breakwaters are. We had put in a request directly following Irene to Army Corps to raise up the breakwater so that at a bare minimum they would at least be visible at a high tide, and we had not even gotten a response back by the time Sandy hit. So that's certainly a source of frustration that the infrastructure that is in place designed to protect us from some of the impacts is incredibly inadequate of achieving its goal. Some of the other issues we have a lot of housing authority property within the floodplain, more than any other community in the state. And obviously that population is particularly vulnerable, and we have evacuation challenges. Much of the south end, the areas of the city that are that do get inundated, that you can see kind of down here, this whole area is cut off from the rest of the city by the rail viaduct. Rail viaduct is quite low, so we ended up, have an evacuation challenge. We ended up having the National Guard guarding all of those underpasses to prevent non-residents from entering into the neighborhood for weeks after Sandy. So our response, I'd say, is kind of fourfold: immediate, short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Immediately, we're working on response in an actual disaster. We have undergone a vulnerability assessment with Nature Conservancy, Clean Air Cool Planet, and Greater Bridgeport Regional Council, which brought together all of the agencies in the city that are involved in disaster response, brought together all the populations and the businesses that are in the areas of vulnerability, identified the areas of vulnerability, the sectors of vulnerability, and have come up with a strategy so that we can better respond. Community rating system, which I think folks are possibly familiar with. If you undergo this type of a planning exercise in the community, you actually have the ability to reduce flood insurance rates for homeowners and businesses within the floodplain because you are better positioned to respond in the instance of a flood. In the medium or the short term, I'd say, we're working aggressively on site level solutions to make sure that buildings are more resilient. Much of what I think you heard in the previous presentation about raising things outside of the basements. We were lucky to receive, following Sandy, a $500,000 grant from the Robin Hood Foundation, which will enable us to go into one of the historic co-ops that is in the floodplain and raise electrical boxes and hot water heaters out of the basement and into the upper floors. So while it doesn't prevent flooding in that neighborhood, it will at least prevent some of the most significant impacts. In the medium term, we have a plan to create a berm. There we go. Folks can see this kind of green line right here. Essentially is a landscaped berm within the public land that would protect portions of the neighborhood, particularly the housing projects and some of the infrastructure from flooding in some storms. And then and also in the medium term, we're looking at relocating many of the housing projects using the CDBG disaster response monies that 3 states of the region have been awarded from HUD. We'll be looking to rebuild those units outside the floodplain. And then in the long term, we hope to link this berm with the breakwater and with a landfill and create storm surge barriers at the mouth to Black Rock Harbor and Bridgeport Harbor, which would enable us to close the city down in the most extreme storms. So that's a little flavor of what we're doing. I guess this is just one other thing to say. We're in a partnership with 8 other cities in the region that has shifted its focus to adaptation. New York City has been doing a project to identify the responses. We're a strong believer that it has to be arranged responses. You can't just retreat and have natural solutions in places like Lower Manhattan or downtown Bridgeport. And so we're currently embarking on a scenario planning process with those sister cities so we can collectively plan for response so that we're not doing it on our own and in a vacuum.